When you stand at the edge of Lake Norman today, it's easy to believe it has always been here. The water looks calm, permanent, natural. Before Lake Norman, this landscape looked very different. The Catawba River wound through farmland and wooded hills. Small communities dotted the countryside. And for generations, families built their lives along the land beside the river. If you listen to the bonus episode, Before the Water, you know that this river shaped the land long before a dam was ever planned. Today, we're narrowing our focus, not to the lake yet, but to the communities that grew here before the water changed everything. What you'll hear are snapshots drawn from places like Mecklenburg County and Catawba County. Not the whole region, but moments that help us understand what life looked like along the Catawba River before the lake.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chuck McShane, data analyst and historian in the Charlotte area, and the author of History of Lake Norman, Fish Camps to Ferraris.
Historian Chuck McShane has studied the history of the Lake Norman region and the communities that once lined the Catawba River. So, can you give us a brief history of the area that would eventually become Lake Norman? Like, what was the region like before the lake was created?
It was a very rural area. It was the banks of the Catawba River, so it was primarily a farming area, driven there, drawn there by that rich land, rich soil that was around the riverbanks. So for many years, it was primarily focused on farming, cotton farming to a certain extent in the 1800s.
For generations, life here revolved around farming and the river. Cotton fields stretched across the landscape, small communities formed around work, worship, and kinship. Even after the Civil War, when parts of the region began to industrialize, the area remained deeply agricultural. Progress didn't arrive all at once, it came in layers. To get a closer look at life here, we can focus on one place, a town once known as Liverpool. And no, I'm not talking about the Beatles' hometown. Known today as Cornelius in Mecklenburg County, where daily life was shaped by the rhythms of farming. Fields stretched across the countryside, and families worked the land, raising animals and passing property down through generations. One of those families was the Connor family.
My name is Michael Connor, and I'm the grandson of John Connor, which John Connor Road is named after, living in Connecticut, North Carolina.
Michael Connor grew up hearing stories about his family's history. Like many African American families in the Carolina Piedmont, his family built their lives through farming and land ownership, even during a time when segregation limited many opportunities. And I'd love to start by hearing a little about your family's roots. What's the connection between your grandfather, John Connor, and the land near Bettysford Road that became a part of Lake Norman?
Okay. Well, my family roots starts way before John Connor. It's like uh, Margaret Connor, which was born in 1815. Then her son, Cheeseman Monroe Connor, born in 1855, was my grandfather's father, and his mother was Janie Johnson. And they left Lincoln County, Catawba Springs County, and they came down this way, first stopping in Denver, and then they came to Limley Township probably about 1908. My grandfather, John Connor, was born in 1884. So he came with my grandfather, and he was the oldest son of, because my grandfather's second wife had about 16 children, and he was older than they were. So they started here in Limley Township, and my grandfather was on Beatty's Road at the time. In 1922, he bought. It's during the Jim Crow era. He bought property here. Now he had to bid on the property, and the man that won the bid was a white man named Charles Gibson. Charles Gibson won the bid, But for some reason, Charles Gibson said, "Nah, nah, nah, I don't want it. Give it to John Connor." And so he gave 67.5 acres of land to John Connor. Of course, my grandfather had to pay for it. Um, and that started my grandfather uh, being a farmer on Beatty's Road.
And so, what made him become like? What was he doing before he bought the land? What was his profession?
Yeah. Now that's really interesting. My grandfather had a watch, and on that watch was a train. So they were building the railroad up here called Caldwell Station. So I believe my grandfather worked with Caldwell Station to get his money, because my great grandfather was up here as well. He did not own property, so he was more like a sharecropper or tenant farmer. But my grandfather wanted to own property, and he was a little man, so I think in this community that he was in was called the Caldwell community. So he probably worked with the railroad so that he could get money so that he could buy a farm and start, farming. So I think that's where he got most of his money. And I could tell you that he also, after he got the 67.5 acres, he also bought some more property. And so he had about 125 acres of land. So he farmed up here. He had the property, and he was becoming a farmer at that time.
But the Connor family's story is just one part of a much larger landscape. As families built lives on the land, the Carolina Piedmont had already begun to change. Across the Carolinas, textile mills began appearing along rivers that could power their machinery.
And into the early 1900s, as the area became more industrialized after the Civil War, you had a lot more industrialists and textile mill operators taking advantage of the water power that was enabled by the fall line there along the river. So you had emerging industrial area in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Industrialization was spreading across the region, and rivers like the Catawba were becoming valuable sources of power. Alongside farming, mill work shaped daily life for many families in this region. It influenced where people lived, how they worked, and how communities were formed. Historian Richard Eller has spent years studying the rise of these towns.
Yes, I am Richard Eller. I'm a historian and a professor of history at Catawba Valley Community College and executive director of Red Hawk Publications.
Across the Carolinas, textile mills began appearing along rivers that could power their machinery. We set our focus on one of the many mills that called Catawba County home. Can you give us a little history about Long Island Mill and the other mills that were basically submerged by Lake Norman in that area?
Yeah, in the early days, all mills were located on waterways because that was your power source. This is before the era of the steam engine. So Long Island is one of those that goes way back and was damming up the river in order to create a power source for it.
Mm.
After the industrial age comes, which is really, the 1890s, right towards the turn of the century. The steam engine came along and said, you no longer have to do that. You can have a mill any place you want to. So the town of Newton, which is not on a creek or a river, had a cotton mill, and they used steam. The Long Island plant had its own water source, its own power source. And so it was one of those older mills. And it wasn't the only one displaced by the damming up of the Catawba River at various places. There were bunches of them.
And can you share a little background about the Long Island Mill and why it was such a central part of the community before Lake Norman?
Well, it was one of the places, one of the best places that you could build a cotton mill because it had the river water there to turn the turbines and that sort of thing. So early on, when it was built, it was a grand place of employment. People coming off the farm could go there and get a job pretty easy. And the cotton mills made it so that once one generation joined, it was so much easier for the next generation and generation after that, so they would have guaranteed employees. And that whole region of Catawba, Iredell County, it was the main employer.
For many families, mill work offered something farming often could not: a steady paycheck, regular hours. But for others, daily life still revolved around the land itself. To understand what farm life along the Catawba River was like before Lake Norman existed, it helps to hear from someone who experienced it firsthand. Before the lake was built, what was life like on this land?
Okay, before the lake was built, cause we would come up every weekend to visit Grandpa and Grandma. And at that time, Baysford Road was a straight shot. There was no water dividing us, and we could just come straight up. When we did, it was always dirt roads and things up here. Um, wasn't a lot of activity. Wasn't a lot of lights. Electricity wasn't here. When nightfall fell, it was dark. I mean, if it wasn't for the lightning bugs, we couldn't see a thing at night. Really. And my mom didn't like us coming up here so much because the kids up here, they were summertime, they were barefooted. No one had shoes on, but mom didn't want us to not have shoes on. Things like that. There was a pond on the property, and we could go fishing and things like that. But my grandfather had cows. He had a dairy farm. He had a bull. He had hogs. There were chickens. There was a lot of stuff up here, and I never saw them go to the store because there were no real stores here.
For a child growing up in Charlotte, visiting the countryside felt like stepping into a different world.
But my grandfather, they basically ate off the land, the stuff that they grew, and things like that. So the food was always really good because my aunts, they knew how to cook, man. So we always had good food. Um, but the thing is, it was so bare, and then the other parts, it was just woods and stuff. Now my uncles would go; they had hound dogs, and they would go hunting, and they'd be hunting for rabbits. And you couldn't eat rabbits year round, so the time that we could, that's when they would get rabbits, and we have some rabbit stew or something like that. We didn't eat a lot of that because mom, she didn't know how to cook that. My aunts did. So we go back home, we eat real, what we call real food, and we just ate country food when we came to the country. So they had liver mush, things like that. And now the pies and stuff were good because they did a lot of canning at that time. They canned pears, peaches, apples. They had granny apples, and they had sweet apples. They had sweet apple tree too. So we ate some of those things as well. Um, they would go because they I guess they would go to the mill to get the flours and things like that. So we did have cake and things like that. I always remember the sweet stuff that we had. And so he had a lot of fruit trees. So there were a lot of plums. Oh, and the corn was so good. And there were like rows of corn. I mean, it's like acres of corn that he had. He also grew sugar cane. There was a lot of sugar cane, and we ate molasses and things like that, which in the city we didn't eat any of that food. I mean, the other kids there, they had no idea what this stuff was, but we had molasses, and we had pancakes, and we had molasses on the pancakes. Um, we had country ham. Um, there was butter that they churned, and it didn't taste like the butter you bought from the store. And so we called it country butter. But it was good with the biscuits that they made and things like that. So the eating was totally different from what we ate in the city. But also, they didn't have running water, so there was an outhouse that you have to go for the bathroom and things like that. And then after they were washing dishes and stuff, that we took that stuff became slop, and they took that and fed it to the hogs. So anything that you didn't eat got into that slop bucket and stuff, and that was taken out to the hogs and stuff. There was little pieces of bread because they would make cornbread and stuff, and you fed some of that stuff to the chickens and things like that. So it was totally different from living in the city because chicken were running around all around, and they were little bitties and stuff, and we couldn't have any of that in the city. So we did have a dog in the city. That's about the only animal we had.
Farms like this were largely self sufficient. Families grew, hunted, or preserved much of the food they ate.
But in the country, we got to see all the other animals. There was a gray mule, and Gray was help Grandpa plow the field, and we see him plowing the field. He didn't use a tractor. My grandfather didn't know how to drive, I don't believe, because he was always getting behind the plow and plowing the fields and things like that. And my aunts would take hoes and they would be hoeing things for watermelons and all the other vegetables that they had. And then there would be a big garden in the in the springtime that they'd be working on. And by that time we get up during the summer, we'd be able to pick some of the things that they had already grown: cabbage, uh, watermelon, cucumbers, squash, and all this stuff that they grew. Tomatoes we ate, and so coming up every weekend, that was our straight shot, man. We were glad, because hey, we're gonna have some real food and stuff. But we also gonna have this place where we can just run around. It was so open, nothing was closed, man. Everything was open. We didn't go in the woods unless it was like picking blackberries or something like that, because in the woods there were snakes and things, which we, unbeknownst to us, that they were even there. But we understand when Aunt Janie would wake us up in the morning, say we got to go pick the blackberries before it gets hot, and we put on these big clothes and stuff so the chicken things wouldn't mess with you. And we start picking because we know we're gonna have a blackberry pie if we do this right. And Aunt Janie would stand there with a hoe in her hand, and we didn't know why she was just standing there with the hoe in her hand. As we grew up, we found out that she was watching out for the snakes, because snakes would be in those blackberry briars and stuff, and everything grew wild and stuff. And then on the way home, Mr. Gitano stayed up the street, and you could smell the grapes because he had grapevines. And we stopped and get some grapes from the Gitans, and we move on home, man. It was pretty good. Um, Now, most of the African Americans that lived up here, I was told later on, this was called Connorstown, where my grandfather knows where that's where the church was. But the other folk that lived up in Smithville, we didn't come in contact with them that much, because that was they're only about 3 or 4 miles away, but it's you got to cross a bridge and stuff to get there today.
Smithville was a community built with intention. Founded in the early 1900s, it grew from formerly enslaved families creating space for themselves in the late 1800s. It became one of the largest African American communities in Mecklenburg County, a place where people built what they were often denied elsewhere. It became one of the largest African American communities in Mecklenburg County, a place where people built what they were often denied elsewhere. And even as the region changed, Smithville remained, carrying that history forward. And while communities like Smithville were building lives just beyond the edges of town, for families like Mr. Connors, their world felt more rooted in the land.
But we didn't hang out there that much. We were mostly at my grandfather's place. So the city of Cornelius wasn't something that we, stayed and played in. We played among ourselves, and if anybody came by, we played with them and stuff. And then sometimes we bring kids from the city with us to play. And then those kids learn where milk came from, because that's the first time they saw a cow. They thought milk. The milkman put the bottles of milk in the front door. That's all they thought. They had no idea it came from a cow. And then they saw it. They said, "That's where it comes from." Yes, it is. And we had buttermilk, because with the milk was getting pasteurized, if they left the bucket and it was bad milk or something, it became buttermilk, and we had that with cornbread, and we ate cornbread and buttermilk. When you go to the north, people say, "What in the heck is that?" You don't eat stuff like that, but we did, man, we did.
For families like the Connors, life on the farm required constant work. Food came from the garden, the woods, or the animals they raised. The seasons shaped daily routines, but just a few miles away, in Catawba County, another kind of life existed: life in the mill villages. So, what did day to day life look like for the families who lived and worked in the cotton mill town?
By our standards, it wasn't easy, although their work was a lot easier than working on the farm. But they lived off of the work whistle. When the thing said they were supposed to be there, they had clocked in, and then 10, 11, maybe 12 hours later, they could clock out. So they spent half their lives in these mills. Some of them went into the mill before the sun went up in the morning and came out after the sun set in the evening. So, they really never saw the light of day other than through the windows of that cotton mill. It was tough. It was monotonous work, but it paid well. And when I say paid well, I mean paid better than farming. It didn't pay well by our standards, but
Mm-hmm.
because they got a check every week, that was something very, very different from what life on the farm had been like when they only got paid once a year when the crop came in. So every Friday they had, change in their pocket, and they could do things that you couldn't do when you were on the farm.
So, what were some of the things that they could do?
Well, they could spend 5 or 10 cents to go to a movie. They could run out and get a bottle of pop. They could hang out at the store because when that whistle went off and they were at the end of the workday, they were free. Now down on the farm, you always had something to do. You were working from before the sun come up till after it went down, especially during harvest season. But now these people experience something that their ancestors who worked on the farm never experienced, and that was free time. And almost they didn't know what to do with it, but gradually they figured it out.
Mill villages became tight knit communities. Families lived near the factories where they worked. Children played together in the streets, and the sound of the mill whistle shaped the rhythm of everyday life. And what do you think made mill towns like Long Island unique compared to other small towns in North Carolina?
They had commonality. It was important that the mill hired as many people as it could. So it tried to bring people off the farm, people from town. And then once all of those people came into the mill and started working regular shifts, they all had the same experience. So they had a lot to talk about. They were a lot of times relatives, at very least friends. If they weren't before that, once they came into the mill, they shared those experiences. And that's what made them almost like a family.
And what role did the mill village housing and community design play in bringing people together? Because they work together as well. It's almost like a mixed use village, if I may use a modern term, almost, but not quite, right? It's not as leisurely as having a pickleball court,
Right.
right?
Yeah, it wasn't near that nice. Although they made their own kind of pickleball because they loved baseball. But what it did was it created sameness, so that the company decided who was amongst the hierarchy and who wasn't. Because if you lived in one of those regular houses, you were just like everybody else, and so that gave them kind of a brotherhood, if you will, that separated them from the foreman's house. And so it made kind of this pecking order that was installed by the mill that they all had to live by. And for this generation that was run out of there by the damming of Lake Norman, they were kind of unique because they were not maybe the first, but they were early on in the era when the Supreme Court had ended child labor. So their parents and grandparents worked in that mill from about the age of 8 on up. What these guys did once the Supreme Court outlawed child labor was they couldn't work there until they were at least 14. So they had a better shot at getting an education and quite possibly getting out of there, which a lot of them said, they had no intention of staying and working for the mill. So in some ways it was for them just as good that the mill was gone once, Lake Norman came. But they still were, as we all are, kind of nostalgic about the place they grew up. The only problem for them was they couldn't go back because it's now underwater.
Mm. That idea of not going back, but let's think about that childhood that was idyllic in this time where there was community. Can you paint a picture of what kids growing up in there might have experienced? You mentioned baseball games. So, did they play? Like, how big of a impact did baseball have on their lives and other leisurely sports now that they didn't have to work until the age of 14?
Well, it had a great impact because the the factory had a baseball team, so they could all go and watch. And so that was a source of a spectator entertainment that they could have. But then these kids also played baseball as well because some of them had aspirations to, play for the company team. But it also allowed them a lot of running around time after school that they were kind of like latchkey kids. There was always stuff to do because their parents coming off the farm did not believe in idle time, so they had chores that they had to do. But they could sneak some leisure time in too, and then if they could get a nickel or a couple of cents even, they could go down to the store and have a bottle of a soda, a dope they called them in those days, a soft drink, and kind of hang out with each other and then look for things to get into. Sometimes those are not exactly, savory things. They might be mischief, but they could always play a lot of games that they invented. Hide and seek was, one of those. All those kinds of kids games that you play when you ain't got anything to, organize for you.
Yeah, you kind of organize your own things. And let me go back. Did you say they call soda? Did you say dope?
Dopes, yeah. It goes back to the days when Coca-Cola was made from cocaine,
Yeah.
and it was a real pick me up. After they outlawed that and they come up with caffeine, the name kind of hung on. I mean, people call it various things. They call it cola, they call it soda, they call it pop. But on a lot of in a lot of southern towns, they referred to it as a dope up to the 1960s when they finally figured out, oh, this is the bad name to call it. So they found a different colloquial name for it, a different nickname.
See, I learn something new every time I do these interviews. I've never, like, I remember being like just shocked when my teacher in middle school from West Virginia said pop. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah,
Pop,
yeah,
but maybe pop is better than dope. I don't know, but I
yeah.
love those little things that, unfortunately gets lost in time, the things that we call different things. For some families, life centered on the land. For others, it moved through mill villages, where work and daily life were closely tied together. I also want to talk about like some of the challenges of living in a small town, like traveling to get like did you have things? Did you have grocery stores? The things that make a town, or were these more communities that they had to travel to different places to get the things that they needed?
Oh, yeah, they definitely did, and they were really closer to, even though they were technically in Catawba County, they were closer to Statesville. So when they got paid and went and got groceries, they would go into town, into Statesville. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some things that you could buy at the mill, within the mill town, because the mill was the center of the town, and then you would have all these little stores that come around to help people on a day-to-day basis. So they had what, in essence, for us would look like a convenience store, but it was a little kind of mini grocery that you could get salt, the basic staples kind of stuff that you needed on an emergency basis, and it was a place to hang out.
Can you talk a little bit about company stores and how those operated?
Yeah, the one at Long Island didn't operate like this, but a lot of them, before this was rendered illegal by the Supreme Court, a lot of cotton mills would only pay you in script, which was their money. And so you couldn't spend it anyplace else. You had to spend it at the company store because they're the only ones that would take that kind of currency. Now, again, the Supreme Court said that you can't do that because what it allowed was the owners of the mill to make money off of you twice. They made money off of your labor, and then when you tried to spend your money at their store, they jacked up the prices so that they're making a profit off of you when they're selling you stuff that you can't buy anyplace else because the money wouldn't spend. So it was, it was a racket, and places finally had to admit, yeah, we're skimming money off of our employees in two ways, and so they had to pay them. Now there was a kind of an intermediate step where companies would pay you in like legal tender dollars, but they would give you back your change in what they called doogaloos, and these are little coins that said you could only spend your change with us because again it was specific to that cotton mill, and people didn't have too much of a problem with that. It was better than the alternative of only getting script from the company store. So it was sort of a kind of halfway mark in between just getting your change back in legal tender and you go spend it someplace else. You had to spend that change with them.
And you said Long Island didn't do that. That meal was a
No,
little different.
yeah, that mill was, by some standards, it was pretty modern for its era because it didn't do that. But then again, you had all kinds of people who were employed there that had really hardships that you didn't see in other places too. So I mean, it was kind of mix and match, in that some people used a boat to get there because they were on, they lived on the other side of the Catawba River. They didn't live in the mill village, and so they would take a boat to go to work in the morning and then take the boat to get home in the evening.
The company store wasn't just a place to shop, it was part of a system, one that shaped how people lived, how they earned, and sometimes how they stayed. And so, how did the culture of the cotton mill towns like, Long Island shape people's values, worth ethic, or sense of belonging? And then, how was that even like reshaped when they had to leave that area?
Well, if you go way back, people used to refer to working at a cotton mill as public work, that you worked in and amongst the public. So now you were not on your own farm doing your own thing when you chose to, because it's two very different lifestyles, working and living on a farm versus working in, say, a cotton mill. Because on a farm, as I said, there was always something to do. You always had a chore that you could be doing, either to help the crops grow or get ready for the next crop that you're getting ready to put in the ground or harvest it, whatever. There was always something. But especially during the summer, there was this time called laying by time when the crop was in the ground and you didn't have to tend it directly. You could sort of let it go. And that's when people would, in that whole area, would go to places like camp meetings, Balls Creek, which is one of the camp meeting sites not far from the Long Island Mill, still meets 2 weeks out of every summer. And I think it's early August, early to mid August. That's when you could hitch up the wagon, take the whole family, and go stay in one of the tents, which is really just a little shack, for a couple of weeks. So what really farming life like was really rather secular, in that you knew every September, oh, we're getting ready for harvest season, or you knew in February we're getting ready for spring planting. It followed a cycle like that. And at a cotton mill, when you went to work in public work, you didn't have that same sort of rhythm. You had a daily rhythm. It was linear. It was always something new, something different every day. And that was a real change of lifestyle for these people who were used to, planting by the signs, watching what the weather was doing. You didn't have to do that nearly as much in a cotton mill because you were inside and you had a specific job. But as long as you did that job, as monotonous as it may be, as long as you did that job, then there was no way that they were going to get rid of you because they needed your labor.
Out of these communities, farms, mills, small towns, came a shared way of moving through the world. Work wasn't separate from life, it was part of it. But these communities were not untouched by the realities of the South and the times. Segregation shaped where people lived, where they worked, and what opportunities were available to them. Skilled jobs were often segregated by race and by gender. And when we think about Long Island meals, were they integrated or were only like where did the people who worked the mills, where did they come from? And was it a negative connotation to work in the mill as opposed to being farmers? Like in some places I've heard there was a negativity for being a mill worker as opposed to like a farmer. Like you were considered someone who lost your farm.
Yeah, because a lot of people did, and that was the way that they ended up making ends meet if they couldn't make it on the farm. And farm life was tough, but one of the things that people took pride in was being land poor. You may not have a whole lot of money, but you got land. And there was a certain pride in that, that as a mill worker, you didn't even live in your own house. You lived in a house that you rented from the company. Now the company would cut you a deal, and the more of your family members that work there, the cheaper your rent would be. But you didn't own anything, and you got that money every Friday when you got paid. But you never owned anything outright, unlike a farmer. So a farmer could claim to be part of the landed gentry, and a mill worker couldn't. And there were all kinds of nicknames for them. I mean, the most famous one is to call people a lint head. And so when these kids would go into town, dressed as they were, the town kids recognized that and would make fun of them.
And were the mill workers, were they integrated?
Not with, I mean, there were African American workers in the mill, and generally they worked on the rough end. It's kind of like furniture factories too. They did the dirtiest, toughest work when the raw material is coming into the factory and getting it ready for the process of turning cotton fiber into cloth. So the mill was integrated in that respect. But in terms of each department, it was pretty well segregated. Either if you worked on the rough end, then that's the job for African Americans who were treated as second class citizens and were given those jobs. And they also paid less. But as you got to the refining parts, those were segregated for white workers generally. And, the interesting thing about cotton mills is that you needed a lot of labor, but you didn't need a lot of skilled labor. And
Mm.
so there were jobs for women just to tend machines. Now, sometimes they were tending 100 machines, and so they had to keep their eye on all of these machines going at the same time. And if one quit working, the thread broke or something, then they would have to shut that down. They knew the process for getting it back going and then start it back up. So the real skill jobs that paid the best in a mill was the machine fixers, and those were always male, and they were generally men with experience. That was a job that you could work your way up to.
Was that a dangerous job as well?
It could be, because if you did not know how to go into that in between the intricacies, because these things are clacking all the time, they're going up and down, especially the looms, but also the spinners are in this process, and it's metal. So if you stuck your hand in there and didn't understand what you were doing, you could get some fingers chopped off. And remember, that was the days before there was any workman's comp for any of this. The company might take some pity on you, and then again, they might not, depending on what kind of worker you were. But there was benevolence on the part of the ownership. They would put out big spreads for Christmases, so families would have things to give their kids. Now, it really wasn't toys very much. More, it was more like fruit. But you ate pretty big. They would give you a ham and that sort of thing. So there was that kind of company welfare that you would see. But on a daily basis, you weren't paid very well, and so you had to get by as best you could.
Before the water came, there were lives built here. Not just structures, but routines, relationships, and histories rooted in the land. What we think of now as Lake Norman was once something else entirely, something lived in, worked through, and known intimately by the people who called it home. And while the landscape has changed, those memories remain, carried in stories, in families, and in the ways people continue to remember what was here. In the next episode, we'll begin to look more closely at how that change unfolded, how plans for the lake took shape, and what it meant for the communities in its path. Made in Carolina is created, produced, and hosted by Lolita Rowe. This episode featured voices and insights from Chuck McShane, Michael Connor, and Dr. Richard Eller, whose memories and perspectives helped shape the story. Original music is by Sister Sai. Additional audio elements were sourced from Freesound with full credits listed in the show notes. To learn more about this episode, including sources and archival materials, visit madeincarolinapodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following the podcast, leaving a review, or sharing it with someone who might connect with the story.